the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Saturday, August 19th. I hope everybody's having a fantastic weekend. Thanks for joining us here on the Yaron Brook Show to discuss China. All things China. My focus today is going to be on economics, on the state, economic, if you will, state of China. But I'm happy to answer questions about other issues, foreign policy related issues, U.S. relations with China, anything strategic, anything that you think would be interesting. Of course, the Super Chat is open for all questions, not just China-related questions, although China-related questions will get priority. But I will be taking questions on everything else. RDF, thank you. Really appreciate the support. All right, so yes, use the Super Chat to ask questions on wherever you want to take the show and whatever the questions you have. It has been a tough week for China. It's for the Chinese economy, for news coming out of China in terms of its economy. It's really been a tough few months and arguably a tough few years for the Chinese economy. I mean, just this week, we've seen the real estate crisis in China extend to additional real estate developers. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but it seems to be much broader than just a few real estate developers that we heard about. Everglade, that filed for kind of defaulted on debt back 2 years ago, is now filed officially for bankruptcy in U.S. court under Chapter 15, which allows them to hold off paying U.S. creditors while they restructure the business in China and elsewhere. So in terms of real estate, but beyond even the developers themselves, what you're seeing is a lot of the shadow banking system. That is the variety of private lenders who are not part of the banking official banks. They are in trouble. They face enormous. They have enormous debts that are basically linked to the value of real estate. Value of real estate is collapsing as these developers collapse, and as the other thing that came out this week, as real estate prices in China decline. So the official number is that real estate prices are going down maybe 2 to 5%. Most estimates are projecting that real estate prices are declining, and this is apartments, condos, homes in China are declining by 15 to 25% in value. 15 to 25% in value. So you're seeing a dramatic decline in the value. Now, remember, I mean, Americans are pretty dependent on their home and the value of their home, and it's a really important part of, I think, people's net worth. But in China, this is the primary way of saving. Most of the Chinese public is not in the stock market. They're thankful for that. They don't have saving accounts. They don't have money in various investments. They have it in real estate, and many people have more than one apartment. Real estate was supposed to only go up. Remember those? Remember that in the U.S. only go up, and developers offered all kinds of cool, enticing ways to invest in real estate in China without a lot of money up front. That led people to invest in projects all over China in what ultimately became empty neighborhoods, empty cities, empty towns. And that real estate is now being slashed in terms of the value that it has. And it's interesting that the prices are declining really, really fast. And at the same time, nobody's selling. Nobody wants to sell. I mean, some people are forced to sell, but nobody wants to sell. Because the fear is if they start selling, they don't want to recognize these losses. They don't acknowledge the value lost. Of course, the longer you hold on to a falling asset, the longer it can fall, and the deeper your losses become. There is this mythology in America, and I think in China as well, that real estate ultimately never declines. Long term, it's valuable. But that is not true. That is not true. So real estate, massive problem in China, and real estate has played a huge part in GDP growth, a huge part in the economic growth, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years in China. It's been to a large extent real estate and infrastructure driven. But is that real economic growth? We'll get to that. At the same time, at least 5 investment banks are now cutting their projections for China's economic growth this year. Everybody is saying they will miss their 5% GDP target, GDP growth target. Remember the days where China was growing at 12, 15%? Well, those are long gone, long gone. And now, they can barely, they are not even growing at 5%. And arguably, if we got real numbers out of China, if the numbers were accurate, China's probably it probably is in a recession, pretty deep recession, and might have been in a recession since COVID began, right? So, but investment banks that are using kind of official numbers, recognizing this isn't happening. As we said, the shadow banking industry is in real trouble. This giant called Shongji, something like that, has suspended payments on nearly all of its investment products. It plans to restructure its debt. It's one of the largest kind of financial companies, non-bank financial companies out there in China. Stunning. It is completely cash-strapped. And the reason is that a lot of its investments were in real estate. Real estate. China's, remember, Chinese growth is not going from 5% to 3%. Chinese growth is going from 5% to negative some number. Negative some significant number. We might, even officially, Chinese growth will probably be under 3%, but unofficially, in terms of reality, Chinese growth is going to below zero. Chinese assets are being sold off. The stock market is way underperforming stock markets globally. Has been way underperforming stock markets globally since COVID, and it continues to be a poor investment. There was a slight rally in July, and it's given back everything, and turning negative on top of that. In addition to that, China's super leveraged. I mean, people complain about the amount of leverage we have in the United States. China is in terms of the total amount of leverage, is much more levered than the U.S. Maybe the central government isn't as much, the federal government isn't as much. But if you take into account all the different forms of government, if you take into account all the different entities in the economy, and you look at households and everything else, it is well over 300% of GDP. It's a real challenge. So if they want to, quote, stimulate the economy, we'll get to stimulate the economy in a minute, where are they going to borrow the money from? And who's gonna lend it to them, given the risks that are inherent in lending money into a highly, unbelievably leveraged economy? Let's see. One of the things happening in real estate is that this is spreading from privately owned real estate company to now government-owned, state-backed developers are also getting hit. 18 of the 38 listed state builders have reported preliminary losses for the first half. It's probably more than that. These are just preliminary. We'll see what it turns out to be. Remember, most of these are government-backed, and yet they're still suffering enormously. All right, let's see. Even Tencent, the big technology company, the big successful technology company in China, is seeing sales not hit expectations, be dramatically below expectations, and are struggling. All right, so across the board, China's economy is struggling right now. And you could say, yeah, it's just a recession. Everybody goes through a recession. We'll deal with that in a minute. So the question is, there are a few questions. One is, why? Does China get out of this just like the United States has a recession? They get out of it. The economy goes back to growing fast. Is China just another economy that can just have another recession? Is that a reality? So what are the causes of the economic slowdown? What are the prospects for China moving into the future? And what consequences does this have for the Chinese Communist Party? What consequences does this have to the CCP? The CCP is different than the American system of government. Does that matter in terms of how China will respond to what's going on, and in terms of how it exits this particular struggle, this particular challenge that it faces? So let's first turn to the causes, and to get to the causes, I find it interesting. I'm looking at some people who are writing right now about the causes, and it seems to be that the causes right now are basically, it's demographic collapse, it's demography, which is certainly a factor, right? It's demography, and it's it's overinvestment. It's exactly what happened to Japan. They'll see a collapse, and then maybe they'll go through a period of stagnation. If that's the outcome, that's really, really bad for China. We'll get to why that is, but China is really struggling, is really having a hard time, and it is not in the same position as Japan was when the Japanese real estate market collapsed in, 89 or 1990. It's not the same, partially because China is a lot poorer than Japan was at that point in time. And China has, we'll talk about it. China has an authoritarian government, and Japan did not. And even so, Japan has stagnated since then. If you look at GDP per capita in Japan relative to the United States, it's pretty pathetic. I mean, it's like, even adjusted for purchasing power parity, for the cost of living, it's almost half. It's just higher than half of the GDP per capita. Do you know what the GDP per capita? I mean, people think of China as this. What's the GDP per capita of China right now? Well, if you just straight GDP per capita is about $12,000. Anybody want to know what U.S. GDP per capita is right now? $12,000. Now that's amazing, given that it was less than 1,000 when Mao died. Less than 1,000. Right. What do you think GDP per capita is? Japan is not one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, Japan on a purchasing power parity would be poorer than Mississippi. So it's rich, but Japan is poorer than, it's somewhere at the level of, it's poorer than most countries in Europe, which is pretty sad. So China has gone from under 1,000 to 12,000, and if you adjust for purchasing power parity, if you adjust for the cost of living, in a sense, then China's GDP per capita is 17,657. 17,000. About half of Japan's. Japan's about 35,000. Right? I'm doing GDP per PPP. So we've gone from China's about half of Japan. Japan's 35. U.S. PPP, non-PPP U.S. is 80. Is around 80. But if you adjust for the cost of living, and this is tricky because cost of living is not the same all over the United States. But if you adjust for the cost of living, the United States is 65. So 65 versus 17. Right? 65 versus 17. I don't know who this Ikaya is here, who's a big China promoter. I'd love to know what his agenda is. Anyway, just to give you a sense, right? China. But here's the point, and I want to talk about how China became rich, or relatively rich, right? How it went from below basically $1,000 GDP per capita on a again price purchasing power parity to over 17,000 to almost 18,000. How did that happen? What drove that? And to do that, we need to understand what happened in China starting in 1978, and accelerating, I think, during the post-Tiananmen Square, and then what's happened over the last 15 years. Because the Chinese growth model and the Chinese performance economically and the cause of Chinese wealth is really super important, right? Is super important to understanding what's happening right now in China. If we don't understand the history, if we don't understand why China became relatively wealthy, why China had the highest growth rates in human history, really, I mean, astounding economic growth. If we don't understand that, then we can't understand why it's struggling now, because something fundamentally has changed. Something fundamentally has changed in the Chinese political system. Now, maybe it's not fundamental. Maybe it's not the case that Chinese philosophy has changed. The fundamental philosophy of the Chinese government has not changed. But what's changed is the way they're applying it, and the way they're applying it economically, and the perspective. Xi has a very different perspective than his predecessors. Now, I am not a Chinese expert. I don't spend all my time on China, but I have a broad understanding of what's happening in China. So names, dates, I'm not going to get right. But I think it's important to understand the big picture of what happened in China in terms of economic growth. Obviously, in 1978, China was an unbelievably poor country. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had gone through periods of starvation. It had gone through periods of massive famine, of millions and millions, tens of millions of people dying. Obviously, it was an authoritarian state ruled by a brutal system and a brutal dictator, Mao Zedong. And in 1978, the person who took over the Chinese regime, it was still authoritarian. It's still authoritarian today. It was Deng Xiaoping, and Deng had been a communist loyalist. He had been Mao Zedong's right hand. He had been responsible for the deaths of thousands, millions probably, of Chinese people. He had done some horrible, horrific, disastrous things, but he had pissed off, Mao Zedong at some point, and he was sent out as part of the Cultural Revolution to the countryside to live among the peasants. And I think when he was out there, he realized at least one thing. He realized that whatever they were doing, whatever the Chinese authorities were doing, if their goal was somehow economic success, if their goal was somehow prosperity and a good life for the Chinese people, or they were failing miserably. The countryside was poor, dirt poor. People were starving. The collective farms were not working. Nothing was working. Now, he didn't understand why it was a failure. He had no clue why it was a failure. But he was observant enough, smart enough to realize that it was a failure. He still continued to believe, to his dying breath, as far as I can tell, he still continued to believe that the Chinese people needed a centralized authority in order to run their world. He continued to realize, he continued to believe that China had to be authoritarian, that it would break up, that it would go into civil war, that the Chinese people could not survive unless they were ruled with an iron fist by an authoritarian leader. But he came to really question the fundamental ideas of communism. And by the time he came to power in 1978, he was not really a communist anymore. He was a dictator, he was an authoritarian, but he was not a communist. And what he was looking for is, how do we, as the leaders, as the rulers, as the philosopher kings of China, how do we bring prosperity to the Chinese people? Because we have failed. Mao Zedong failed. And some of the previous dynasties in previous emperors of China failed. So he turned to the rest of the world and he started to look at, he went to Japan and he was blown away by Japan. Just blown away. Remember, China had been isolated, been closed. Its leaders had not traveled anywhere. You could argue why that is, and the idea of China being the center of the world. But they knew nothing about what was going on, and they knew very little about what was going on in the rest of the world. And the ones who did know kept quiet because they didn't want to offend Mao and the other operators of the Chinese Communist Party. But Deng actually ventured out. And what he saw blew him away. He saw people who are so much richer than the Chinese that it was hard to imagine. And he came back to China and said, I want to be like them, but we want to achieve that kind of wealth. We can't let our people be free, God forbid, politically free. We need to guide this from the top. But we need to find a way to bring that energy, that wealth creation that somehow is in Japan, and it turns out in the US and in other countries, we need to bring that to China. We need to become rich. And slowly, and I've told this story in other contexts, so I'm not going to repeat it all here, but slowly what they did is economically free up, at least to a large extent, certain regions in China. They took the restraints off. They allowed for private businesses. They allowed for entrepreneurial activity. They allowed for people to migrate from place to place to find jobs. They allowed for real business competition. They allowed people to get rich. I think I've told this story, but there's the story, the first guy who became a millionaire in China was a guy who had these carts that sold sunflower seeds. And he had a special formula, and they were really tasty. And they took off, and he basically franchised them all across China, all across this region of China. And he was rich. And the local authorities wanted to crush him. I mean, how dare he be rich? We're a communist country. And Deng Xiaoping said, no, stop it. This is exactly what we want. We want people to become rich. And I realize they're not going to become rich all at the same time. There's going to be inequality for a while. I mean, he had a better understanding of these things than some American leftists, right? But in order for all of us to become rich, in order for China to become a rich country, we need to allow individuals to be rich. And indeed, for a while there, being rich was viewed as a virtue and encouraged and supported by the government. They'd abandoned communism completely, and they still, there's no communism in China today. Except that they call themselves the Communist Party, and they use Mao and they use Chinese symbolism and so on to provide them with legitimacy or power, going back to the heroic fight of Mao Zedong against the colonizers and against the fascists, right? But it's just a pretense, right? It's just a pretense. There's no communism in China. So, Deng basically started opening China up to foreign capital, to foreign investment. At the same time, he allowed Chinese entrepreneurs. He allowed for Chinese entrepreneurs. He allowed people to become millionaires, billionaires ultimately. He allowed a thriving tech sector. And of course, when Deng died, this was continued by people who followed him, the leaders who followed him. And generally, there was a movement for liberalizing the Chinese economy, a movement away from everything being centralized, a movement away from the state running everything, a movement towards privatization, a movement towards at least the pretense of private property, a movement towards a market economy. I mean, they have stock markets in China. No communist country has stock markets. They have a private real estate market. I know a lot of countries that are not purportedly capitalist that don't have private real estate markets. China moved in the direction of more economic freedom, and at the same time, continued political repression. Although even there were periods in which the reins were loosened a little bit and a little bit more free speech was allowed, and you could run a bookstore in Shanghai that actually carried, liberal and free market thinkers, and Ayn Rand could be published in Chinese, and even me, I could be published in Chinese and sold in Chinese bookstores. So there was a period there where even the restraints, political free speech restraints, were moderated, at least to an extent. And of course, we know what happens when you liberate an economy. When you unleash entrepreneurial energy, in particular, in a culture that values education, that values progress, that values knowledge, that values entrepreneurship, which I think historically China has always valued. If you look at Chinese minorities in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, majorities in Singapore, Hong Kong, when they're allowed to be free, this is a culture that supports massive amounts of progress, innovation, and achievement. So there was a massive amount of wealth creation during this period, real wealth creation. There was a boom. There was a real increase in the standard of living and the quality of life. People left the countryside, left the poverty of the countryside, and the countryside was becoming less poor because the countryside was allowed to have, again, pseudo-private property and allowed to basically get rid of the collectivized farming and allowed to privately sell their goods. And when they did that, of course, suddenly they had more goods to sell. So the economic liberalization of China created an explosion of economic growth. And if you add to that the fact that Western investors, private investors, whether it's banks, private equity funds, venture capitalists, private individuals, companies, corporations, started pouring capital and investment into China. This allowed China to leapfrog many of the requirement to build their own capital, to invest their own capital. Suddenly they got capital and knowledge and know-how from overseas. Some of that knowledge and know-how was brought into China voluntarily. Some of that knowledge and know-how was extracted by Chinese authority in order to get access to the Chinese market. And some of that knowledge and know-how was out and out stolen by the Chinese government, by Chinese corporate spying, by Chinese. But nevertheless, it came in. And this resulted in, just unbelievable economic growth, going from one of the poorest countries in the world to 17,000 GDP per capita, and a PPP adjusted is phenomenal. And this is, of course, averages. So if you go to a city like Shanghai, you can see a thriving, not just Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Beijing, Guangzhou, all these cities, you see a thriving middle class, a real thriving middle class. By the way, it's not true that China doesn't have intellectual property rights. It has a legal system that is very strongly defends intellectual property rights. within China. It just doesn't have any respect for other people's intellectual property rights. But if you, Adam Ossoff, an objectivist, law professor, an expert on intellectual property rights, was actually invited to China to help them craft laws in China to protect intellectual property rights. Now, they don't apply them consistently, as you know, because they're an authoritarian regime. That's how authoritarian regimes function, right? But they have the infrastructure. Arguably, you could argue they have better laws on the books protecting intellectual property rights than the United States does, because they had some of the world's best experts come and write them for them, people who had learned from the experience of the United States and Europe and other countries in terms of writing these laws, and they're relatively new. Now, all of that happened between 1978 and 2012 or 2014, or really till the great financial crisis, really till, I'd say the real key marker for China is 2008. And of course, you had some difficult periods through there. I mean, the horror and the horrific, what happened in Tiananmen Square, right? And the murder of tens of thousands of their own people, of young people, of people demonstrating just because they wanted more freedom. And Deng Xiaoping, in spite of being the great liberator from the perspective of economic liberty, Deng Xiaoping ordered the tanks into the streets and ordered the slaughter of his own people, his own young people. China, of course, also made the unbelievable mistake of buying into the environmental hysteria, buying into the environmental panic that was going on through the world. They bought into kind of the stories of the left in Europe and in the United States over overpopulation and catastrophic climate, whatever, global cooling, I guess it was back then, and that the world was going to come to an end because of overpopulation. And the response of Chinese authorities in an attempt to fight overpopulation globally, believing that they were caught up in this Malthusian trap where they could not produce enough food for the people, they preempted that by establishing a one-child policy, which has turned into an unmitigated disaster for China, because it'll have one of the fastest shrinking populations in the world. It's had a very low birth rate for a long, long time because it was imposed by law, and now that the law's gone, everybody's already used to that low birth rate, so couples are not, even though they're incentivized to, they're not having more children than one child. It's also very expensive to live in China and to raise children in China. So, China has seen this from 1978 till 2008, saw this incredible success because it based its, I'd say, it basically based its economic ideas, it basically based its economic programs on the idea that markets actually work, on the idea that America, the United States, with all its flaws and all its problems, is actually a model to be emulated, at least when it comes to economics, not politically. But economics, the United States was the model, the West was the model, markets were the model to emulate. And China did that. And basically people were coming up with all these names for the kind of capitalism they had, capitalism together with authoritarianism. But of course, capitalism with authoritarianism is an unstable model. It cannot survive. One of the two have to give. Either authoritarianism has to disappear, or capitalism will disappear. Free markets will disappear. I think the tipping point was 2008, 2009, the great financial crisis. The great financial crisis did not impact China that much, although it did. But the bigger lesson that China took from the great financial crisis is the impact the crisis had in the United States and the response the United States had to the great financial crisis. America did not respond to the great financial crisis by saying, yep, we need more markets. Yep, the solution And the way to achieve economic growth and growing GDP and growing standard of living, quality of life, is to embrace markets. That's not what the US government did. Instead, they said in order to save capitalism, we have to go against capitalism. We have to increase regulations. We have to increase government spending. We have to bail out all the banks. We have to stimulate everybody and everything. And China looked at that and said, this market thing is not working for the US. Maybe we need a pivot. Maybe we need to look for something else. And I think starting in 2009, China became more and more skeptical of markets. And in 2012, Xi came to power. And, he definitely brought with him a heightened skepticism of markets. And during that period, Europe then had its own massive crisis, if you remember the Greek financial crisis. And China was looking at the West and saying, is this really the model we want to emulate? And of course, at the same time, the Chinese are authoritarians. And when looking for solutions to how to achieve Chinese economic growth and looking at the West and saying, well, that model is not acceptable. What model should we adopt? Well, Xi knew exactly what model to adopt. From his perspective, the slowdown in economic growth in China and ultimately, what was going in the US and in Europe were all a consequence of too much free markets. He'd come to the same conclusion as the Bush administration, as the the Obama administration had, and he came to the same conclusion. And that conclusion was, too much capitalism, too much freedom. Too much free markets. What we need is more government controls. What we need is more of a mixed economy. What we need is more government management, government guidance, government steering, call it what you want, of the economy. And really, it didn't happen fast because I think Xi, particularly in his first term, was still feeling it out, the levers of power in which he could pull and which not. Also, the Chinese Communist Party functions in very complex ways. The leader of the party doesn't have complete control. I think Xi now does. But when he started out, he didn't have complete control. And there were significant elements within the Chinese leadership that wanted more economic liberty, that actually still believed in markets, as hard as it is to believe. And refused to let go of the vision that they had 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, of achieving massive amounts of wealth, of becoming the largest economy by unleashing these market forces. And they continued to push for that. So Xi couldn't move very quickly. But he moved. He moved slowly and systematically. And I remember being in China in 2016, and then in 2018 and 19. And in 2016, everybody was still, this Xi guy. I mean, everybody here, I'm talking about my hosts, Chinese academics, Chinese freedom fighters, Chinese liberals in the classical liberal sense, Chinese libertarians. I mean, this is a period in which they established a Hayek society at the what's the name of the university? Maybe it'll come to me, maybe it won't. But at the major university in Beijing. And then on one of my visits, they established the Ayn Rand Society inside the university at again, one of the top universities in Beijing, in China. And these people, they thought that no, he's just trying to stop corruption. He's just trying to clean shop. He really is a believer. He's a believer in freedom, in markets at least. And he won't do anything. By 2018, certainly by 2019, their opinion had changed completely. He was not only clamping down on economic liberty, on economic freedom, he was clamping down on whatever political freedom was allowed, whatever free speech was available. He was shutting down free market think tanks. He was shutting down the clubs at the universities. He was not allowing me to speak at the university. I mean, it was the first time in China where I was censored by the government. The government called the university and said he cannot give a talk tomorrow. You can do it at it wasn't Tsinghua University, no. He cannot, he can speak at a hotel, he can speak at some private venue, but he can't speak at a university. And by the way, professors are not allowed to go and listen to his talk. Neither students. So we had to reschedule the talk to do at a hotel. Some professors did show up. Students did not. And it was the first time I felt, I knew we'd been watched. That was obvious from my first visit, not my first visit, from my second visit to China in 2007. It was either 7 or 8 when Atlas Shrugged was published in Chinese. But we were being watched, but we were not being stopped. This was the first time we were stopped. And of course, later on, when I tried to go to China, I was told, yeah, don't come. No point, don't come. So, and then of course, you remember the Jack Ma story? Jack Ma, who was the richest man in China at the time, and who had been incredibly successful, incredibly innovative. I mean, China had been incredibly innovative in social media, primarily in bringing payment systems into social media. It was way ahead of the United States in electronic payments, way ahead of the United States in electronic banking. Indeed, and all of it integrated into its social media. In many ways, Alibaba was in some ways ahead of Amazon. And what's the other? Tencent was ahead in some ways of Facebook. And they had spun out insurance companies and finance companies, and Jack Ma was one of the richest people in the world, the richest man in China, and he had been respected by the people within the Chinese Communist Party because he had brought all this economic growth and he had brought all this wealth, and they realized they needed these entrepreneurs, and during that period, the entrepreneurship flourished, and incredible successes. Some of it driven by government subsidies, but most of it not. Most of it driven by a private economy and U.S. venture capital and American and European capital. And it was a boom, a massive boom. I think around the time of COVID, around the time of lockdowns, and remember, the Chinese were the ones who invented lockdowns. They were the first ones to lock down. In a sense, the West copied China. The West became China. And during that period, Jack Ma, at a conference, dared to criticize the Chinese central bank, criticize Chinese financial regulations, said something like, if you want continued economic growth, if you want continued economic success, lay off. And his reward for that was that he basically disappeared. His IPO of Ant Group, which was the insurance and finance arm, was basically shut down. The IPO was. He became a lot less rich. His wealth deteriorated in dramatic fashion. And then other entrepreneurs were shut down. Basically the state mechanism started to enforce regulations, go in and regulate businesses. Entrepreneurship, particularly in tech, was discouraged. Xi reoriented the economy, and it started reorienting the economy somewhere around 2016 towards state-run enterprises and away from the private sector. He made it harder and harder and harder for the private sector to thrive and be successful. But there was still momentum. There was still this amazing momentum that China had during this period from the private sector. But as we know, the more you regulate, the more you control, the more money you take from one sector to another, the slower the economic growth is going to become. And that's what's happened. Add to that the fact that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration are being aggressively anti-China, if you will, both in terms, primarily in terms of the words that they use, in terms of the arguments, but also tariffs and just talking China down and talking, war up, which I think is a huge mistake, but talking all that up has led to real decoupling. American companies moving facilities out of China. Some of that was already happening because of labor costs, but some of it is clearly a result of the last two administrations' antagonism towards China, moving production to India, to Vietnam, to other places. Venture capital stopped investing in China. Sequoia Capital just spun off their Chinese venture capital arm, and American money is no longer going to flow into China. American investors have withdrawn from China. Some of that, rational economic calculation because of what Xi was doing. Some of it, though, geopolitical, I think, errors by the U.S. government that has led to a fleeing of capital from China. And this decoupling, which I don't think ultimately serves American interests. So this is kind of where we are. And so if you look at the Chinese economy, one other thing I want to say. During this period, I'd say primarily over the last 10 years, the Chinese government was under these heavy pressure to achieve significant economic growth, to achieve particular numbers in terms of growth. And one of the ways in which this was achieved is that the Chinese government gave the regional governments targets for their growth. And a lot of these regional governments, what they did was they borrowed huge amounts of money and poured it into real estate construction. They understood that the way GDP is measured, if you spend money on construction, whether that construction is ultimately used or not, it increases GDP. So if your GDP target is X and you achieve it, you don't care if the real estate ultimately is used or not. If the road to nowhere is actually used or not, if the fast train that almost nobody uses is actually used or not. What you care is that the money was spent and GDP went up. So huge amounts of money went into real estate in order to artificially drive up GDP. What you're seeing right now is the collapse of that ridiculous idea, because you had to borrow. Ultimately, local governments borrowed, real estate companies borrowed, everybody, the people who bought the apartments borrowed, everybody was borrowing. Ultimately, somebody has to pay. There has to be some production. There has to be some wealth creation in order to pay back the debts. But so much of this construction was non-productive construction, that there was no source of revenue to pay the debts. And that's what's going on right now. So if you had to ask, why is this economic decline happening? Why are these economic problems happening? And why I don't think this is temporary and China will overcome it and go back to large economic growth. It's because China abandoned the model that led to what people call the Chinese miracle. It abandoned markets. It abandoned economic liberalization. It abandoned the private sector in favor of state-run enterprises. And we know that state-run enterprises are going to hit a brick wall. We know that state-run enterprises do not work. We know that central planning, in spite of the fact that we in America want to try it, we know it doesn't work. Never has, never will. And yes, at the same time, it's hitting demographic collapse. But you see, this is how bad economists in the US are. This is how pathetic they are. Because today, it's sexy and popular and in to believe in central planning and industrial policy. So it can't be that is causing the Chinese economic problems. It can't be that. So what is it? Well, it's demography. It's not enough stimulus from the government. It's, just exactly what happened to Japan back then. It's all kind of economic macro kind of fidgeting numbers thingies. It's an export-driven economy, and countries around the world don't want to buy their exports anymore. But the reality is that what China is facing is the culmination of 10 years of it slowly but systematically moving away from what led to its success, which is more government intervention, more government controls, and at the same time, no political liberty and no political freedom. So what you're seeing right now is, in spite of this demographic collapse, what you're seeing is a population of young people at the prime, well, not the prime, but at the beginning of their work careers, not working. I mean, you think that the United States has a problem with young people sitting in their parents' basement playing video games. It is a fraction of the problem the Chinese have. They have over 20% youth unemployment. Over 20%. It is so high, and it is so depressing that they just decided this month to stop reporting youth unemployment. That should give you a sense. And it's not just youth unemployment. There's a cultural malaise in China, particularly among young people. A cultural malaise that suggests we don't want to work hard. We've had it. We work hard, we get nowhere. Cost of living just goes up. And we're achieving nothing. I think it's called the lie down movement. I'm just going to lie down. I'm not going to work. Whatever happens, happens. I'd rather be poor than work long hours. So young people don't have jobs. The ones who do have jobs are unhappy. And this is the real brewing problem within China, is to the extent that these young people at some point decide that they've had it, to the extent that at some point they decide that maybe it's the regime's fault. We saw an inkling of it in those protests at the beginning of this year, the blank white cards, where they were protesting the zero COVID restrictions. Imagine if China goes into recession and even more people unemployed, and people see their prospects for the future gone. And this is the real risk for the Chinese Communist Party. That is, when the Chinese lose hope in a future with more riches, after 40 years of being used to economic growth and economic success, and more people moving into the cities, and more people rising from poverty into middle class, what happens then? And do we see another Tiananmen Square? And will the soldiers shoot their own people again? And will it just be crushed all at once? You could see real political unrest in China if economic stagnation sets in and continues. And there's no reason the stagnation will abate, given the tendency of Chinese to move away from markets and to respond and to do what European economists are suggesting for them to do, which is grow the public sector, stimulate. mean, right now, what's happening is, I didn't mention this earlier, is that the currency is plummeting versus the dollar. That dollar, you remember the dollar that was going to implode and the BRICS were going to take over? Well, right now, the yuan is collapsing vis-a-vis the dollar. It's at its lowest rate, I think, in 20 or 25 years. Just like the ruble is collapsing. I'm not sure about the Brazilian, South African, and what is the other, and Indian currencies, but I can't believe that any of them are doing particularly well against the dollar, and certainly South African and Brazilian, their economies are not exactly thriving. Brazil is doing better, but South Africa not at all. So this is not currency manipulation. The Chinese government is trying to hold the currency up. They're trying to buy as many yuan. They're trying to do the exact opposite, and the market is driving it down. Indeed, the whole idea of currency manipulation with regard to the yuan, with regard to Chinese currency, has been a political talking point by Washington, D.C. nobodies forever. And they've all been wrong, and I've been saying they've been wrong for 20 years now. The yuan, if anything, has always been overpriced. Yep, the dollar's going to collapse. I've been hearing that since 1980. Any minute now, any day, the dollar's going to collapse. AJ, come back in 10 years and tell me about the dollar collapsing. Any day now. Problem with the dollar collapsing is there's nothing else that's better than the dollar. It collapses versus what? I've talked about this. I did a whole show on the dollar. Versus what? I agree. Fiat currency is really, really bad. But what alternative is there right now? I mean, that is acceptable politically. I'd love to see gold become money. But gold is not becoming money anytime soon. And every other currency in the world is worse than the dollar. Dollar might be bad. Every other currency is worse, particularly the yuan. So yuan is collapsing right now vis-a-vis the dollar. But that, of course, I know it's Peter Schiff's thesis, but it's been Peter Schiff's thesis for over 20 years. I've been hearing the same thesis for 20 years, and it just hasn't happened. At some point, you have to say, maybe Peter's wrong. I hate to say it. I like Peter Schiff a lot, but maybe Peter's wrong. He was wrong in 2007 and 8. He's been wrong the last couple of years. Dollar still hasn't collapsed. You're certainly wrong in 2008, 7, 8, and 9, when I was on TV together with Peter Schiff, and he was saying gold is going to the stratospheres, 30,000, on TV, sitting next to me, and I was going, I don't think so. Turns out I was right, he was wrong. But, you know, again, it doesn't mean he won't be right in the future, but it doesn't look like he's right now. So, you know, if you're betting on the dollar collapsing, good luck to you. I wouldn't be placing that bet. But one of the things that a lower, cheaper currency does is it makes your goods more affordable overseas. So you can expect to see an uptick in exports, even though up until last month, exports in China were plummeting and imports were plummeting. Both were plummeting. Of course, they're related. Right? They're related. If you export less, you have fewer dollars to do the imports with. Balance of payments, right? And but exports, I expect, will go up. We will all be buying more Chinese stuff. They will be importing less because they have to pay dollars for those, and the dollars are more expensive, so they will be importing fewer goods, which means a lower standard of living for them. So, you know, that is how I see it playing out. I see, you know, generally global stagnation, and in the U.S. Stagnation. I see China stagnating, but I think that is basically China's going to shrink and then stagnate, unless there's dramatic changes in China or in the United States. I mean, what the U.S. should do right now. It should have joined the TPP, the Trans-Pacific whatever, PPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade Deal, TTP, TPP, something like that. But Trump walked away from that. I think the United States could still join it. It's a great deal. It's a way to increase trade with the rest of Asia while, in a sense, isolating China and allowing China to join the TPP only under very severe constraints where, for example, it can't steal property and things like that. The United States should enhance its relationship with other Asian countries, enhance trade with other Asian countries, have free trade deals with as many Asian countries as possible. The United States should support its allies, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, in building up military capabilities to defend themselves against potential Chinese aggression. The one thing that can save the United States from going to war in the Pacific is to make Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea so strong that they can take care of China themselves without U.S. troops getting involved. And I think that's very doable. Just look at what Ukraine is doing to Russia, and you can just imagine what a fully equipped, fully trained Taiwan, never mind Japan and South Korea, could do to China. So the United States should encourage, not encourage, but trade deficits have never mattered. Let investors do what they will. We should stop. I saw an interview today on Ayn Rand University, on the Ayn Rand website, on the YouTube channel, with Scott McDonald, who is a China expert and spent time, I think, in the military before, now as a civilian, really researching in depth into China from a geopolitical, strategic perspective. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in China, to go catch that video. I think it's the latest video on the YouTube, on the Ayn Rand Institute YouTube channel. So I encourage you all to go over there and catch it. He doesn't talk about the economy, but he talks about the politics, the philosophy, and the geopolitical kind of lineup and arrangement. And I think he does an excellent job in presenting that. And what he suggests is the U.S. politicians need to just stop talking about China all the time. They need to stop, egging them on. We should support Taiwan 100% and let the Chinese do whatever they want with that. But free of that, we shouldn't be intervening. Let American individuals and American businesses decide whether they want to invest there. Let American individuals decide whether they want to trade. You want to buy something for China or not? That's up to you. It's not the government's job to tell you who to trade with. Let Americans decide who to trade with and who not to trade with. Let Americans decide where to invest and where not to invest. What we should be focused on is our own problems, our own freedom, our own liberty, and, securing strategic supply chains. So I don't think we should be onshoring semiconductor manufacturing like, Vivek says or whatever. Although Vivek has taken the line about the importance of Taiwan and semiconductors, it's almost like he listened to the show I did on that and took it from that. But I think we should be encouraging, finding ways to encourage semiconductor companies to go wherever outside of Taiwan to build the semiconductors. And what we should be focusing on is what America should have always been focusing on, which is protecting the shipping lanes and protecting the ability of international shipping to move from Asia to the United States free of harassment by the Chinese or anybody else who might want to harass it. In other words, we should be focusing on U.S. national interest, national security interest, properly understood. I mean, there are a lot of things we could do. We should be offering, generally, we should be offering Chinese and Hong Kong in visas to the U.S. if they come here. There's a lot of different things, but Anyway. Yeah, I think the U.S. is too obsessed with China as a national security threat. It's almost like it's egging it on to war. It's like both the left and the right in the United States want a Cold War Part 2. They like Cold War I. I think each side thought they made real gains in Cold War I, and they want to replicate it. I mean, the right believes that a war brings the country together, it unites us, it gives us purpose, it gives us mission. And that's what happened during the Cold War, and what we need is to resurrect that. A Cold War, encourages people to be more conservative, supposedly. The left sees it as, again, a Cold War, bring the country together, but it's an opportunity for us to unionize, and it's an opportunity for us to do more central planning and industrial planning to combat it. But everybody, left and right, wants a Cold War. That's pretty stunning. Pretty stunning. All right. As I said, questions. Please use the super chat for questions. We're way behind on our goal again today. Yesterday we didn't make it, so it would be great if we could make it today. It's not good to have multiple days without it. I'm trying to get Scott McDonald on, so it's been difficult to communicate with him for some reason, but I'm trying to get Scott McDonald on. Hopefully we will. I'll remind my assistant to try him again and get him on, because he was very good on the Ayn Rand. I mean, he has been for years now very good on China, and it would be a great conversation to have him on in terms of that. I mean, one of the things that's interesting that Scott says is he doesn't believe China has the capacity to take Taiwan. He thinks it would be too costly, too devastating for them. Taiwan is too well prepared. Of course, Taiwan could be much better prepared, and he thinks that's the entire national security focus in the Pacific, or not the entire, a big chunk of the national security focus in the Pacific should be on getting Taiwan prepared, on giving it the resources, the weapons, the training, and the resources to be prepared. And the more Taiwan is prepared, the more costly it is for China to try an invasion, the less likely an invasion is. And of course, again, I think Ukraine is serving an important purpose here in showing the Chinese how hard it is. So, and I think the same thing should be true in terms of preparing the South Koreans and the Japanese. And the South Korean and Japanese might have a much stronger national interest in supporting the Taiwan than even the United States has, because they're right there. Just like Europe has a much stronger incentive in supporting Ukraine than the United States has. Now, I think us giving weapons to Ukraine makes a huge amounts of sense. I think us giving weapons, selling weapons to Taiwan makes a huge amount of sense now and if a war starts. I think as long as TSMC is in Taiwan and we're so dependent on it, we might have to defend Taiwan. Again, Scott doesn't think so. Scott McDonald doesn't think so, but no matter, the ideal would be that we don't have to defend Taiwan. The ideal would be that we never have to defend Taiwan. Right. All right, and that Taiwan can defend itself. So China's in trouble. Demographic collapse, unhappiness among the people, real economic challenges, not just small economic challenges, but real significant economic channels. A lot of the central planning along the industrial policy is blowing up in their face in some regard. While they've invested heavily in EVs, and they might become the dominant player in the world in EVs, in electric vehicles, it's cost them a fortune, which again is a cost of economic growth. That is, you might get economic growth in the short run because the industry is taking off, but the industry is inefficient, it's unproductive, it's destroying capital and it's destroying wealth, and that leads to stagnation long term. So industrial policy often looks in the short run as being a huge success. Looks, if you look at China and you see the solar panels and they dominate batteries and electric vehicles, it looks like, wow, what a huge success. It's not an accident that these industries are peaking or achieving this massive success just as the rest of the economy is shrinking, because it's been a massive misallocation of capital. A massive misallocation of capital. There's a story, I think it's in the Wall Street Journal. Where is it? Oh, I closed it. But there's a story, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, about, oh no, here it is, in Bloomberg, about millions of EVs, of electric vehicles, abandoned and are piling up in cities. Massive quantities of these cars, because they keep churning them out because they're heavily subsidized. So they keep churning them out, new models, and they have, the old ones have no value given how cheap the new models are. So people just abandon them and go get a new model. And then you've had a number of collapsed ride-sharing companies that were using these cars, and they're abandoned. So there are millions of these cars spewed all over the cities, and in these massive lots. There's some pictures here of just these massive lots of falling apart EVs, and what are you going to do with them? The batteries are useless. You can't recycle the batteries because the batteries don't have the capacity of new EVs. You can maybe recycle the steel, but what are you going to do with all this massive? They don't know what to do with them. They're just sitting there, hundreds of them, right? So collapse of ride sharing and just the churning of these cars because they're so cheap, because they're so heavily subsidized. So the economic models, the market is not playing a role here. Supply and demand is not playing a role here. So what is going on is you get excess supply and you get crazy phenomena, and as a consequence, that all leads to misallocation of capital, which leads to stagnation. All right, let's take your questions. Again, I'm eager to get questions about China, so please do that. I'm also eager for us to get to our goal, so we're about $400 short of our goal. So please consider asking questions. If you're going to ask questions, ideally they're $20 or above, $50, $100, $200, somewhere that really gets us closer to our goal, to where we're trying to get to. So please consider. We've got over 100 people watching right now. $5 from every person watching would get us there. So you can also do a sticker with just an amount, and that would get us there too. So I don't want to have to mention that every 2 minutes, and I won't. I'm not going to. I just hope that you see value for value and you get something. Who else is going to do an hour show, an hour 15 on China, go into depth in the economy, this kind of overview, not depth so much as broad perspective on the economy, and about the future and the geopolitics of it. So please consider supporting what I do. All right. Let's see. That's off topic. That's kind of off topic. That's off topic. Let's see. A few of these that are on China. Alex says, is China worth going to on vacation? Or do you recommend against that? Why? I've been really enjoying the news roundups and shows on the dollar. Great. I'm really happy you've enjoyed them. Thank you. I think China's an amazing place to go on vacation, right? It's got some of the most beautiful scenery in the world. A lot of it is places that Americans have never been to and don't know. The Chinese themselves, at least last time I was there, and every time I was there, incredibly friendly to Americans. They like Americans a lot, and they're incredibly friendly. You have to be able to deal with the fact that they won't understand you. You have to be able to deal with the fact that you're going to struggle to get around and stuff like that. Transportation is not that easy. Getting people to understand English is not that easy. Everything about being a tourist in China is going to be harder than Europe or even Japan, because they just don't have the tourist infrastructure in many of these places. So you're going to spend, you need to spend money on guides, you need to spend money on somebody who can really show you around, translate, and be with you. So so you're not just meandering and getting lost. But it is amazing. The scenery whether you go up to the Yellow Mountains or whether you go to Guilin. So I've been a tourist all over China, and I've loved it and really, really enjoyed it and benefited enormously from it. So I definitely encourage you to do that if you can. It's going to cost you a little bit primarily in terms of having a guide and private guides and drivers and things like that. It's not expensive, but it does add up. So, go out into countryside. Definitely go to Shanghai. Definitely do not miss Shanghai. Shanghai is maybe the most spectacular in terms of skyscrapers and all of that, maybe the most spectacular city in the world. It's just stunning. So I've been going to, first time I was in China was 2005, and then I was there in 2008, and then I was there in, I think, 12, 16, 18, 19, during that period even more. And yeah, I loved it, and on at least, I think twice, I combined the trip with touristy stuff. And the touristy stuff was definitely worth it and highly enjoyable. Okay, so a few people have given money. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Wes. Who else do I have to thank here quickly? Thank you, John. Thank you, another John Parker, John Bales. Thank you, Rand. Really appreciate the support. So we're getting closer. We're getting closer to halfway to where we need to be. So ticking away at it, but you need this. You need to keep this. You need to keep us on track here. All right. Let's see. That's Richmond's song. Well, okay. Hopper Campbell says, will China or Argentina have a free market revolution before we do? If Javier Milei wins and Xi is overthrown and Vivek becomes GOP nominee, will you become an optimist? Yeah. Milei is this massive experiment. I'm just eager to watch it and see what happens. And how bad could it get in Argentina, given how bad it already is? So I'm curious to see the experiment playing out in Argentina. I can imagine ways in which that would be negative for free markets in the rest of the world, to the extent that he fails, or to the extent that he lands up emphasizing his Catholicism over his free market stuff. But I'm willing to take that risk just to see what happens. I'm at an age where I'm curious. I want to see action. Xi being overthrown is a big one. I think it's going to take a lot. It's very difficult. It's very challenging. Chinese are very tradition bound. It's very hard to make dramatic changes. It happened when Mao died, but even then it took like 3 years, 2 years from Mao's death until Deng actually started making changes. And even then they were slow, really picked up in the early 80s. But we'll see. If Xi is overthrown, that'll be amazing. But of course, what replaces him? Is it somebody who's even more committed to Marxism, or is it somebody who's committed to reforms and the free market? We will see. It's not easy to tell. Vivek, I'm very, very mixed about Vivek. I just saw a video of him. I commented this on Twitter. It's great. He goes after the Fed and all this stuff. He's anti-gold standard, which is a big mistake. He doesn't understand economics, unfortunately. But then he says, I'd fire 90% of the people who work at the Fed. Yes, I'm 100% behind that. And he says, I would give them one mandate, and that mandate is stability of the dollar. Now, so he'd keep fiat currency, but he'd make it said. Now, I'm all for that. I think if you're going to keep fiat currency, that's the way to do it. Fire 90% of the people at the Fed, because too many PhDs, they can only screw up, and then give it this mandate. But then, first, we just have to accept how difficult that is. That would require a law. That would require Congress to act. The president cannot unilaterally change the mission of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is beholden to Congress. Congress passes the law that created the mandate for the Federal Reserve. So you'd have to change the law. You'd have to get a majority of senators, 60 senators and a majority of House members to vote with him. Very difficult to do that kind of stuff, right? And then, so he dismisses the dollar kind of stupidly. And then he says something like, The working class, 90% of Americans have not seen their real wages rise over the last 40 years or something. And then I want to rip out my hair. It's like, God, that is such a myth. That is so stupid. That is so wrong. It's again, the same nonsense as, and again, if everybody says it, if you say it, this I've learned from the left. The left is really, really good at this. Because this is a line from the left. The left has been claiming that the working class and the majority of Americans have not seen their wages rise, and they've been saying it for the last 10 years, really since the financial crisis. They've said, since the Reagan Revolution, since before Reagan, since 1978, the working class wages have not gone up. Now, I know that's wrong. The numbers show it's wrong. Everybody knows it's wrong. But if you say it over and over and over again, and if you say it from the perspective of, if the intellectuals say it, and then the politicians say it, and they keep saying it, and they say it, and they say it, and they say it, people believe it. Including, the guy who sings Richmond, north of Richmond. They believe it. My wages have not gone up since 1978, right? And then what happens is the left says it, and everybody believes it. So people even on the right, like the common person on the right says, oh, well, my wages haven't gone up. So then the politicians on the right start saying it, and then everybody's saying it. And it's wrong. It's wrong. It's not factually correct. It's factually a myth. But if everybody, it's like climate change. If everybody just repeats the myth over and over and over and over and over again, and nobody stands up to challenge it, and nobody stands up to question it, nobody says anything, then the myth is perpetuated. And Vivek is playing that game. Now, I know he has to appeal to his base. He has to tell them they're victims and they're being oppressed, and it's the fault of the Chinese, and it's the fault of the Fed, and it's the fault of everybody in the world. It's the fault of immigrants, of course, and it's the fault of, except his parents, and it's the fault of the elites, and Donald Trump was their savior, but Donald Trump is tainted, so now it's Vivek is their savior. So Vivek, it does not strike me as, I keep wanting, every time he says something good, like shrink the Fed and all this, I want to like him. I want to support him. I want to be able to come on the show and say, guys, you have got to vote for Vivek in the primary. I would love to be in a position to say that. And it's not like I'm some perfectionist who wants a candidate who is 100% aligned. I'm willing to accept that he's going to say what he says about God. I'm willing to accept a lot of the bullshit he says. But what then? Now, if it was Vivek versus Biden, I'd vote for Vivek. There's no question, right? But right now, it's not Vivek versus Biden. It's Vivek versus all these other Republicans. And now's the time to criticize, and now's the time to get them to be better. And again, every time they perpetuate this lie about incomes, they're emboldening the left. Every time they make this rich man whatever, they're emboldening the left. Or at least they're emboldening not the left, they're emboldening leftist economic policies. And that's just stupid. That's just stupid. But I know you can't stand up on stage, because I've done this. If you stand up on there on stage and say, no, you're all better off. You think you're worse off, you're better off. Now, if I got elected, you'd be much better off, right? So your wages have gone up. They could have gone up like 5 times more. But they did go up. You guys are in good shape. You'd be booed off the stage. Rotten tomatoes would be thrown at you. But that's the state of American culture, where saying the truth is unacceptable to the masses. The masses don't want to hear the truth. They have no interest in, let me find this line. This is a great line. There's a great line by this commentator that is just, it was just so good. One second. I'm going to find this because, all right, let's see. I copy-pasted it into somewhere. Let me see if I can find it. I can't. All right, if I can't find it, then... Oh, here it is. This is a line from Vlad Vexler, who's excellent on Russia. I don't think the rest of his ideas, are excellent. But on Russia is very good. But this is the line about populism. This is so good. A key difference between the liar politician and the post-truth populist politician, i.e. Trump. The former deceives citizens. The latter enters into a co-conspiracy with citizens in which both parties half agree the truth doesn't matter. Now that's brilliant. That is the best explanation for what post-truth populist politics is. It's a co-conspiracy in which citizens and the politicians agree, or kind of agree. It's not even agree completely, half agree. The truth doesn't matter. So it's not just lying. Lying is easy. Every politician in history's lied. They all lie, right? Some more, some less, but they all lie. It's when the public doesn't care if you're lying anymore. When the public accepts that most of what you're saying is a lie, and you're in on it, and you're winking to one another, and you've accepted the fact that lying's okay. Everybody's accepted the fact that lying's okay, including your supporters. That's when you get to this post-truth populist, Trumpist politics. And that, I think, is brilliant, because I've never heard anybody define it quite this good. Because it takes it away from, well, what's unique about Trump? He just lies, and I always said, well, he lies and he doesn't care about lying. Everybody else seems to care, but it's not that. It's that he knows that his audience doesn't care that he's lying. He knows that they're okay. Not that they don't care. They're okay with his lying. That they're in on a lie. That they're all participating with it. I don't know how we got into that topic, but anyway, it's going to be hard to make me an optimist, Hopper Campbell, but I'm curious about what happens with Milei, and if Vivek is the GOP nominee, I'll certainly be significantly more positive than if Trump was the nominee. So I'll be, anybody but Trump, but Vivek would make life interesting. I'm as you notice, I'm interested in interesting these days. I want something interesting to happen rather than all this stagnating, boring stuff that they're doing. Anne says, is it possible your anger about Trump was a factor in not seeing the China threat early enough? Maybe. I don't think so. Because, I still think that my comments about China at the time were right. And I don't think Trump was tough on China. So I don't think it was that Trump was tough on China, that he saw something I didn't, because I think Trump has been weak on China, particularly relative to Biden. I think Biden's been a lot tougher on China than Trump was. What else? I think I probably stayed too positive about China for too long, but I don't think it's because of Trump. I think it's because of my experiences in China, and I had a what do you call it, a first-handed bias, and it wasn't until I went there in 2018, I think it was 2018 or early 2019, and when it was clear that everything was being clamped down, it was over, and then I shifted. But nothing Trump did about China was right. I mean, maybe with the exception of some of the military stuff, nothing he did about China was right. The tariffs were wrong. I mean, Biden's restrictions on selling them advanced chip technology makes a lot more sense than the tariff. So I still think Trump was, and I think Trump significantly weakened the United States vis-a-vis China by going and groveling before the dictator of North Korea. I think that was a massive foreign policy error and mistake. I think that Trump, what did Trump do vis-a-vis China other than, he kept us out of the TPP, which was a massive mistake vis-a-vis the Pacific. And Trump, what else did Trump do? So I don't know. What were the factors that made me too optimistic about China? I think it's primarily my personal experiences there, and the people I knew there. But I don't think it has anything to do with Trump. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you foresee the relationship between Russia and China becoming? I think it's going to be ultimately and continuously be a form of a rivalry. I do not see under any circumstance, under any foreseeable circumstances, I mean, I might be wrong, an alliance, a proper alliance, a real alliance. I don't think Putin wants to align with China because China would be significantly superior to him. And he doesn't want to play second fiddle to Xi. Xi might want an alliance primarily to distract the United States from China, but it's not clear that's working. China, the United States still seems to be pivoting towards China while supplying weapons to Ukraine and doing a pretty good job at it. Even though it's a Biden administration, they're doing a pretty good job at it. Yeah, I mean, the idea that Russia and China are going to align and create a currency and have this BRICS thing is pure fantasy and delusion. BRICS means nothing. The Chinese and the Russians do not see eye to eye on most things. The only thing they see eye to eye with is opposition to the United States. And the only thing that can bring Russia and China into each other's arms, I will say this, the only thing that can bring China and Russia into each other's arms is if the United States keeps pushing China and pushing China and pushing China and pushing us towards more and more kind of a Cold War. I think that is what might lead China and Russia to align themselves. But I think under normal circumstances, China and Russia do not like each other, don't trust each other. It goes back even to Mao's days when they didn't like or trust each other. It's why Mao opened up to Nixon. It's why Nixon went to China. It's because China and Russia were unfriendly. I don't think they're natural friends right now. Both of them are competing. I'll give you one more geopolitical thing. Both Russia and China are competing for influence in Central Asia. They both want the stands. Russia believes that Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and all these stands are part of theirs. China thinks they want influence there. They believe Russia is a fading power, and I think the war in Ukraine has just emphasized that more to them. I think that setting up. I think we have to play this balancing act of not driving our relationship with China into a Cold War, and at the same time not appeasing the Chinese. And I think that is not hard to do if you're just smart about it. And the problem is that I think that Trump was really dumb about it. Biden is also dumb about it. He does some good things like the chip restrictions, but then he just does things that just the sole purpose is to make it clear that we're heading towards a Cold War. It's just silliness. So there is a way to calibrate the relationship where we don't give in to them. We assert our presence in the Pacific Ocean, and we assert the fact that we are not going to allow them to upend the shipping lanes from Asia to the United States. We can support in much more aggressively than we do today Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and encourage them to build up their militaries. And we can trade with everybody and encourage, in particular, trade with non-Chinese. And that's what the TPP was going to do. It was going to increase free trade. It wasn't a free trade deal, but it was going to increase free trade. That is, it was going to reduce barriers to trade. I'm always for reducing barriers to trade, even if they're not reducing them to zero, which is the ideal. Better reduce a little bit than to zero. So no, I don't see Russia and China becoming allies in any significant way. Dictators, you remember Stalin and Hitler were allies. How long did that last? I mean, dictators don't do very well as allies, particularly when they both seek dominance, right? If one's powerful and one's weak, that can work. But if they both perceive themselves to be powerful, it won't work. All right, let me just see if there are any other China questions. Yeah, one. All right, $20 questions, guys. And if anybody has and is willing to support this with $50 or $100, that would be great so we can reach our target today. Today, not tomorrow. No one says there is also the Malay, and you talked about here in the West, so it's interesting to hear the same is happening in China, but worse. Yeah, it's definitely happening in China. And there's a sense in which it's worse because they're starting out in worse shape. They're poor. They're already poor. It's sad. It's sad because China was the most energetic, vibrant, exciting place I'd ever been to when I went there for the first time, and when they went there pre this current decline. And it's lost that vibrancy and energy and optimism and positivism about the future and excitement. And that's sad. Sad for any people. If you love humanity, if you love people, if you love the human race, then you're saddened when stuff like that happens. All right, let's do $20 questions, and then we'll do the rest. We still got a while, so still plenty of time to make up. Again, we've got over 100 people watching live, so $3 from each person right now. Value for value as a trade would get us over the limit, so please consider doing a sticker to support the Yaron Brook Show. You can also support the show with a monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon is great, and on PayPal through yaronbrookshow.com/support. All right, Pablo asks, should an objectivist lawyer make use of unfair, non-objective law to win a case? I mean, today, I think you've got to use what's available. That is, you can't, as a lawyer, you can't say, well, this law is objective, so I'm going to pay attention to it. You can't do that. And, you have to treat the law as the law. It's one of the things that makes being a lawyer very, very difficult, or a judge being very, very difficult. Do you ignore non-objective laws? But you can't, because otherwise the whole rule of law falls apart. And you've got to, you don't want to be immoral, but if the law says X, then that's X, and you take advantage of it or don't take advantage of it. But you've got to respect. That's your job. You've got to respect the law as it is and use it as it is, right? And if you can, fight at the same time against the non-objective laws. But you can't lose a case because, I don't know if you're prosecutor or not, prosecute a case, or if your judge rule against someone. You have to go by the law, the way the law actually is. You can't go by your philosophical judgment of whether a law is just or right or objective or not. It's, that's the cost you pay for being a lawyer. Very hard, very hard. All right, Shazbot for $50. Your evaluation of the Rich Man song reminded me of Syrio Forel. Syrio Forel. I don't know who that is. The master sword teacher from Game of Thrones. Oh, yeah, that guy. He said that the key to great swordsmanship is true seeing. Is this an ability that you share with him? Certainly I think that one of the things that makes me effective at what I do is that I see through the bullshit and that I care about truth. I care about truth. I don't think a lot of people care about truth. And that's why we're seeing the cultural decline that we're seeing. I think people care about reaffirming their prior beliefs. I think people care about not being wrong. I think people care about not connecting, not offending other people, not offending themselves, whatever. But I think that one of the things that makes me what I am is that I care about the truth. I seek the truth. I'm not interested, is this red or is it blue? Is it Republican? Is it Democrat? Is it consistent with objectivism? Isn't it consistent with objectivism? Is it consistent with that? I have to defend China because, hey, I said stuff on China in 2015 that I was wrong about. I need to defend that at all costs. Yes, even when it comes to Trump, especially when it comes to Trump, because so many of you, and I've given up huge quantities of revenue, huge, because I'd rather be true to the truth than suck up to you, my audience, or distort in order to present a view that is, palatable to certain people. I have the courage to say it like it is. And some of you respect that, and I think that's why you support the show. But I know that some of you don't, and why you don't support the show, and why some people have abandoned the show and left and gone away, and I've lost huge numbers of people, and it's directly correlated to things that I say that are unpopular. So yes, I don't know that I share it with Syrio Forel because I can't remember what the nature of his truth seeking is. I think it was more mystical in that case, but yes. I consider myself a truth seeker, and I think I'm pretty damn good at it. Doesn't mean I don't make mistakes. Doesn't mean I'm not wrong. It just means that I'm always looking for what is true and what is right. And I try to correct when I discover that I'm wrong. And you've heard me say I'm wrong on several times. All right. Let's see. Yeah, if you like the show, do a sticker, do a super chat. All right, Liam says, off topic, but in Israel, did you feel a lot of pressure to be friends with all your neighbors, whereas in America, people leave you alone? Yes, absolutely. Israel has this, you got to fit in, you got to be part of society, you got to be, everybody's your cousin, everybody's your friend, everybody's your relative, everybody's in your business, which I don't like. In America, people leave you alone. Did you find people in Texas were more neighborly than Southern California? Yeah, I think generally that is true. People know neighborly, but people in Southern California were very friendly and still had this attitude of, we can be friends, we cannot, it doesn't matter, basically leave you alone. And but I didn't find people in California cold. People in Southern California were very friendly. And Northern California as well. In San Jose, we knew some of our neighbors and didn't know other of our neighbors, but the same was true in Texas. So I found people in America, in both places, super friendly. People in Austin were more friendly than people once you left Austin. Maybe because my wife, anyway. I think there's more racism in parts of Texas than many people realize, at least when I lived there. Once you leave kind of the metropolitan areas. And we experienced that because my wife does not look, like a white Texan. Clark, are free market ideas becoming mainstream enough in the culture that enough people will view them as a legitimate alternative to implement in real economic disarray takes place, like we're seeing in Argentina? Well, again, I don't think that's what you're seeing in Argentina. It's not like free market ideas are mainstream in Argentina. It's not like people see it as a legitimate alternative. People are pissed off. They're angry. They're upset. And they're willing to try anything. And then comes this guy who is angry, reflects back the anger, and who happens to be a free market guy. And he yells and he screams and he's entertaining and he's charismatic and he gets them riled up. It's not because they're free market. And he might not win. But they're not mainstream, these ideas. And so don't view what's happening in Argentina as some fantastic positive sign of the world. The world is shifting, because it's not. The reality is that Argentinians are so desperate, they're so angry, they're so pissed off, that they're willing to take a shot at a crazy man Not because they agree with his economic policies, but because what the hell? Everybody else is screwed up. Let's go with it. Let's roll the dice. And that's not a sign of significant cultural change. And I don't think one projected onto America. And I don't see free market ideas becoming mainstream. I just don't see it. The contrary, I think free market ideas are losing ground. And you can see by the fact that not a single Republican candidate is making free market ideas the hallmark of their campaign. Because they know it's a losing strategy. Adam says, Biden does everything for Ukraine 2 years too late. I agree. Would Ramaswamy send weapons to Ukraine on time? Probably not. But I don't know, right? I have a feeling that Ramaswamy's position in Ukraine might change once he's actual president and once he's actually in that position to make those kind of decisions. I think most of the Republicans, that would be the case. I do, however, encourage the Ukrainians to kick the Russians out before the U.S. elections, because for them it's better to get the weapons now from the Biden administration than to see if Republicans feel like they want to give it to them or not. But somebody like Ramaswamy, who I think is smart and is not ideologically anti-Ukraine and he has no love of Russia. He might be convinced once he's there to keep supporting Ukraine, and might be convinced with the rational argument that if we actually give them the weapons fast, they can win fast and get this over with, rather than giving them this trickled weaponry slowly. Lewis, what would you say to people that tell you their grandparents lived under Soviet communism and told them it was a great period and life was great? I tell them their grandparents don't know what they're talking about, and that they are, to the extent that they believe that, they're brain dead, and that's what communism did to them. It fried their brain. But I knew people in the 1980s who came from the Soviet Union to Israel in this case, and said they hated Israel. They wanted to go back to the Soviet Union. I mean, they hated to go into a grocery store and have choices. What do I need to choices from? 7 types of toilet paper. Just give me one toilet paper. What do I need this for? It's just a headache. Well, but their mind is fried. They've lost a sense of personal value. They've lost a sense of what is possible in life. They've lost a sense of personal values. And that's what the Soviet Union did to them. The Soviet Union destroyed their sense of self, destroyed their sense of personal values. And to the extent that personal values were gone, the Soviet Union was fine. It was comfortable. It was, if you're brain dead, Soviet Union's okay. But that's what they did. That's how they survived for as long as they did. And the people who rebelled against the Soviet Union were the young, who rejected this idea of no personal values. And it's only because they were slowly introduced to jeans and rock and roll and personal values from the West. And suddenly they said, whoa, why don't we have that? Why can't we experience that? The older people, they'd already accepted their personal values mattered none. So don't pay attention. Just because somebody's old doesn't mean they're wise. Says, I love your show, but people who disagree with me are brain dead. No, but in this case, they are brain dead. I mean, that's the reality. I'm not saying it's an argument. It's a reality. It's the truth. They are brain dead. People who think that life under the Soviet Union was wonderful are brain dead. And their brain was destroyed under the Soviet Union. Their brain was fried in that regime. That regime destroyed the self. It destroyed an orientation towards self. It destroyed an orientation towards values. And therefore, they have no ability to appreciate freedom because freedom was denied to them for so long. Personal values were denied to them for so long that they never, once Soviet Union fell, they never managed to gain an appreciation for personal values and an appreciation for freedom. And in that sense, maybe brain dead is wrong. Maybe it's their soul is dead. But whether that's a good argument or not, I wouldn't argue with your grandparents. I think it's a bad idea to argue with people. If somebody tells me, I lived under the Soviet Union and life was better then, I would say, okay, and I would walk away. There's no argument because they're brain dead. So I'm not saying that you should argue to them, oh, grandma, you're brain dead. And they go, oh, yeah, that's right. Thank you for enlightening me. Of course, that's not going to happen. But that's why you can't argue with them. They were indoctrinated, but it's not just indoctrinated. I mean, you have to read We the Living. If you read We the Living, you get it. Their individuality, what made them them, what made them unique individual human beings, was wiped out systematically by a collectivist regime that didn't care about the individual, that wanted the individual to have no identity, to have no values, to have no reality, and succeeded. And the grandparents are just proof that they succeeded. All right, anyway. All right, okay, last reminder. With a few $20 questions, we can make our goal. We've still got a bunch of questions for me to answer. So please consider supporting the Yaron Brook Show with a sticker, but even $5, even $2, even $20, $100, $200. Just a reminder that you can use that sticker feature to support the show value for value. I just want to say one more thing. The real evil of the Soviet Union, the real evil of communism and collectivism is not the economic stuff. It's not the authoritarianism. It's what it does to the human soul. It's that it crushes your individual identity. It crushes your ambition. It crushes who you are. It crushes your capacity to value. That's the real evil. And to the extent that certain grandparents have that, it's to that extent that they were successful in doing that. And that's evil. Well, God. If you have a question for me, use the super chat. You can just do it with $2 or $5. Why are you asking in the chat? I mean, some people are, I'm not going to answer them because some people are putting money to ask questions, and then I'm not going to answer. So if you're interested in, for example, how an ideology can make you brain dead, $5 will get through the chat, and I'll answer that gladly. But and the same with the rest of you. You comment and you ask questions, and you almost never contribute to the actual show. You free ride, completely free ride, off of everybody else who actually does. That doodle bunny. Oh, thank you, Narcissa. Narcissa, thank you. Really appreciate the $20. That's great. That doodle bunny says, in regard to your critique of Richmond's song, why is it whining for people to vocalize when they're being screwed? Are you whining when you complain about your show not going? Yeah, I mean, I am whining. I probably shouldn't do that. You should call me out when I'm whining. Please don't. Yeah, I think it's whining when somebody complains about stuff and has no solution to offer. And I think to admire somebody who's whining about how bad things are, but it's so concrete bound, the whining, right? I don't know. It's blaming others. It's not taking any kind of responsibility. But yeah, I get it. You could have protest songs that are complaining about the state of the world and complaining about your own life. But this is so concrete bound. I mean, I'm thinking of, I don't know, think about some of Bob Dylan's songs that are really about complaining about the state of the world, complaining about what's going on in the world. There's so much more fundamental and deep. I'm really turned off, and maybe this is the issue, right? I'm really turned off by the BS wages, the way he talks about wages, and the fact that he has no semblance of a solution, and the song is so political, and it's so narrow. It's just not interesting. But yeah, complaining is okay if you're complaining about. Yeah, I mean, you need to think about the difference between this and I don't know, how does it feel to be on the road like a Rolling Stone, like a complete unknown? I mean, there's something much more psychological, much deeper, much more not quite metaphysical, much more ethical about what are you doing with your life, which Bob Dylan is challenging you. Or even when he says, Blowing in the Wind, the song Blowing in the Wind. It deals with war and peace and hunger, and it's a leftist song, but it deals with fundamental, deep, big issues. And this guy's complaining about his wages and complaining about obese people. It's just, I find it very, very whining. And of course, country music has the disadvantage of being whiny to begin with, right? The whole tone of it. But yeah, I don't have a problem with a song being down. I don't have a problem with the song being complaining. But this song really comes out as shallow and thank you, Jennifer. Shallow is a good word. Shallow and whining. Yeah. And if I whine here, then please let me know, because I shouldn't. All right, Richard, thank you. When I briefly worked in Russia, some people missed the old Soviet days. I assumed their families must have benefited from communism. What do you think? Yeah, I think in some cases that's the case, but benefited. Put that in quotes. So they had a slightly higher standard of living than the average Joe. They still had a very low standard of living. The big thing with the Soviet system is they were taken care of. The big thing, I mean, this is the song, right? They got their welfare check, and they didn't have to think for themselves, and they didn't have to get a wage. They just got a stipend or whatever. So I don't think it's just that they were taken care of. It's just that they have such a narrow view of the world. Like, even the most taken care of person in the Soviet Union is living a pathetic life. So it's the fact that they've given up on personal values. That's the bottom line. Because if you have personal values, you don't want to be taken care of. You don't want to get favors. You don't want to live off of other people's backs, which is what all the people who were taken care of in communism were. You want to make it. You want to build. You want to create. You want to do. But communism takes that out of you, because when you act to create, to do, to pursue your values, they get crushed. They get oppressed. You're told, don't do that. You're not supposed to pursue your own values. And little children are probably told, don't do that. You're going to stand out. You mustn't stand out. You can't stand out, Johnny. If you stand out, the commies will come. If you stand out, they will come to get you. If you stand out, they'll come and get your parents. Don't stand out. Be like everybody else. Don't pursue your values. Don't pursue your happiness. Don't pursue what's yours. And it oppresses that, and it sucks the life out of a human being. And it's done from childhood. Free stuff is not good for you. And of course, free stuff can't last. So you get less and less and less free stuff. And you get poorer. But free stuff is not good for you. It's bad for you. And telling you constantly, don't pursue your values. Don't pursue your ambitions. We will kill you if you do. We will kill your family if you do. We'll send you to the gulag if you do. From childhood on, that kills the human mind. It kills the human spirit. It's soul destroying. Lewis says, why don't billionaires build skyscrapers as they used to because company boards have no ego? No, because cities won't approve it. They won't approve they won't zone it for skyscrapers. Now, you still get skyscrapers. There's some new skyscrapers in San Francisco, mostly sitting empty these days. I just, you can, on 57th Street in Manhattan, you can see some new skyscrapers. So once in a while they get built. But the reality is that New York, the previous mayor of New York said, I don't want any more skyscrapers. We're not going to approve any more skyscrapers. And then it's a certain ambition and a certain spirit and a certain sense of life that says, I'm going to build skyscrapers. And, again, that's a way in which it's being sucked out. Even if you buy the air rights, you still have to get the approval of the city. The city has to approve your skyscraper. There were very, very ambitious projects to build beautiful skyscrapers in Chicago. And they were killed by the city council, by the rotten economy. Chicago still has some gorgeous skyscrapers, and some of them are new. But so I'd say it's primarily city governments. And again, New York does have new skyscrapers. So you do see some that have gone up. And even Chicago has some new skyscrapers. Again, I don't know who inhabits them, but they do have them. The other thing is you need dramatic economic growth. But, you're not going to build a skyscraper in Palo Alto, which is a flat area. So Apple's not going to build a skyscraper. Instead, they build that round building. But in San Francisco, there's some skyscrapers that went up. Salesforce built a skyscraper. So there's still skyscrapers being built. Bree says, if you like fast cars, you should look into Andretti Racing School. I did it today. It's fun and fast. I got up to 141 miles an hour, and my honey got a blue ribbon. Oh, so cool. I'm copying the name of the race school, Andretti's Racing School. That would be fun. I would enjoy doing that. One of these days, that would be a blast. Let me just find the place where I need to put this. There it is. All right. Thanks. Thank you, Bree. Let's see. Wesley. By the way, we're less than $200. $10, $20 questions, $4, $50 questions, and we're at the target. Wesley says, if there was an objectivist country stronger than the U.S., would it be immoral for them to topple our government since our POV, we don't respect rights? Since in their point of view, we don't respect rights. I think objectively we respect rights enough that I don't think, and again, I think Ayn Rand had some principles about when a government is basically free and when it isn't. And I think that America still qualifies as basically free. So no, I don't think they would. I don't think we're at the point where we have no sovereignty, which is the standard. We'd have to repress free speech much more than we do. We'd have to repress free elections, and we'd have to have political prisoners. Three things that I don't think we really have. Free speech is the one most threatened. It's still not the level that I think would qualify for, not a free country, we can overthrow the government. That Doodle Bunny says, life sucks, people are something shit. Change my mind. Oh, you want me to change your mind? Life doesn't suck, life is amazing. It's so much fun. Even in this crazy, immoral world, you can still do amazing things. You can still experience beautiful things. You can still fall in love. You can still produce. Stop being so negative about the world in which we live. It's pretty amazing. All right, what is a soul according to Objectivism? Rand wrote, we have a self-made soul, absolutely, but I'm not sure what that means. It basically means, your mind, everything, the content that you have in here, structured around the choices that you've made. So souls, I'd say a lot of people don't have a soul. A soul is the you know the you don't know. That's why I'm trying to explain it. Ankar Gade has an excellent essay on this in the companion to Ayn Rand studies that came out. It's an excellent essay on what a self-made soul is. And a self-made soul is basically the choices that you've made to build up a certain type of an attitude, a mind, everything. The sum of your emotions and your mind, how you think, how your subconscious interacts with your psychoepistemology, your consciousness interacts with your psychology, and how all of that interacts with your state of being and your emotional state and your emotional world. That integration, that which you would call I, is the soul. It's not something I can point to. It's not a particular cell. It's not a particular feature. It's the full experience of a conscious being that is in control of his mind, that has chosen his values, that is built up. It's more than a sense of life, right? It's a sense of life of what? It's essentially what makes you. And most people, and it's integrated. It's an integrated whole. If it's self-made, if it's made properly. And for most people, it's a mishmash, and it doesn't integrate into anything. It doesn't add up, really, into anything. I don't know if I did a good job there, but I will try to. I would try to come back with a better. I'm writing down soul. I'll try to come back with a better answer to the soul question. What is your opinion of Alan Greenspan? RDF says. I think he's Robert Stadler from Atlas Shrugged. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, he is brilliant, knowledgeable, and a complete betrayer of his own values, a complete betrayer of his own morality or stated morality. I think at the end of the day, Alan Greenspan is a second-hander, a social metaphysician. He feeds off of the group that he's with. When he was around Ayn Rand, he was brilliant and an objectivist. As soon as he went out of her circle, he adapted and absorbed whatever was around him. He was not a first-hander. He was a second-hander. And I really do think he basically abandoned all the principles that supposedly held when he was with Ayn Rand. He's a bad guy. He's a guy who sold his soul for power. Sold his soul for power. Sold his mind for power. If you read his autobiography, you get that from it. You don't even have to. I mean, he to some extent he knows it. It's in the biography. He didn't adapt to survive. He adapted to control. He adapted to he sold out. Didn't adapt to survive. He could have survived a variety of different things. He was very successful, independent of selling out. Don't ever let the same people disappoint you twice. Yeah, true. James says, people will look for your weakness so they don't have to listen to you. All right? Probably true. Yeah, I'm sure it's true. Seth says, you mentioned people moving from rural China to cities was a good thing. Should people who live in rural areas, regardless of country, move to more urban areas? Yeah, and they have. I mean, 250 years ago, it's part of what civilization means. 250 years ago, almost all of the population was rural. Almost everybody lived in rural areas. And the Industrial Revolution and the 20th century and the 21st century were periods of urbanization, of people moving to the cities. That happened in the West, it happened in England, it happened in Western Europe, it happened in America. And it's a healthy, civilizing process. You're richer because of the division of labor and the concentration of people, and concentration of people is a good thing, concentration of talent. Urban areas are richer, more diverse. They're more diverse in terms of opportunities. They create more wealth. Absolutely. The whole process of the last, I mean, think about Rome. This is I'll give you a good example. The Roman Empire saw massive urbanization because it was a civilization. All civilizations are centered around cities and see a process of urbanization. The great example of this is Rome itself. Rome in the 3rd century AD had well over 1 million people in it. Well over 1 million people in it. Crowding is a good thing. Overcrowding is complete subjective. Crowding is a good thing. And crowding is a wonderful thing. That's why people do it. They do it constantly when they have the opportunity. So let me go back to Rome. Rome had well over 1 million people in it. At the peak of the empire, it had well over 1 million people. In 600 AD, 400 years later, it had 10,000 people. And that's the Dark Ages. There wasn't a city in Europe that had 1 million people until London in the early 19th century, when civilization came back. If you think about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, if you think about the movement of people, they were moving to the cities, to where culture was, to where civilization was. And that's a process that we see everywhere in the world. At the beginning of time, everybody's rural. Cities are a major achievement in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Greece, and then in Rome, and then it implodes and everybody scatters to the countryside. They die and they scatter, and their wealth and their knowledge and their culture and their civilization declines dramatically. But a city is where you get a concentration of talent, of people cooperating with one another, trading. The countryside, particularly pre-communication, pre-transportation, is a desert. There's nothing there. So cities are a reflection of wealth, and they help create wealth. They're amazing things. So yes, I think that's the process. Now, whether in a tech-intensive world where transportation is cheap and quick and easy, whether that still holds vis-a-vis cities, we'll see. We'll see how humanity evolves. But certainly over for all of human history to date, the movement from the countryside to the city is a sign of wealth, prosperity, and civilization, and economic growth. All right, I'm going to make this the last appeal. We have 109 people watching, which is pretty good. We have just a couple of minutes remaining, but if you'd like to support the show and show value for value, you're all listening, you must get some value from this show. It's gone on for over 2 hours. And I think this might be the first show that went for over 2 hours where we didn't make our goal. So $150 short of our goal. Just a reminder. Frank says, can Oliver get better job if he shaved his beard? I don't know, probably. Whether you shave or not, how you dress and stuff like that does matter in job interviews, it turns out. So maybe if he shaved his beard, he'd get a better job. But for some people, their beard is more important than a better job. I don't know. Probably. But not what I hold against him is his beard. All right, everybody. Thank you for all the super chatters. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you for all the listeners and watchers and everybody else. Seth says, I asked a $10 question and you gave a $20 answer. Here's the difference. Thank you, Seth. I really appreciate that. That is wonderful. No shows tomorrow. We're back on our regular schedule on Monday. So we'll do news roundup starting Monday morning every day next week. We'll do a show on Thursday and on Tuesday and on Thursday. We will go from there. Let's see. All right. I will see